what makes two individuals have different personalities. And this is even part of the component, like when we have twins, identical twins, they still aren't gonna have the exact same personality. What makes two individuals unique? What contributes to how we understand personality? This is chapter 11, and we're gonna talk about some of those factors, some of the theories related to that. We're gonna understand a little bit more about personality, maybe a little bit more about how they're shaped and how we can predict some of the components tied to it. So what is personality? In the psychological perspective, we think about it as these long-standing traits and patterns that make up an individual. Remember back in lifespan development, we were talking about, are these traits gonna be there through the whole long path for this individual? What we're looking at is this part of their personality? I mentioned about my son, and he actually was willing to tell the truth about taking the quarters from his dad's dresser. One of the things that's a hallmark of that individual, that child of mine, is he's a truth teller. And that has been there since he was verbal, and it remains there. And I suspect it'll be there for the rest of his life. Not that that's the only kind of trait. There are other behaviors related to, is this someone that's interested in taking risks? Do they consider the components at large, or are they more like someone who's cautious and watchful? Some of those kind of components are the ways that we understand personality. Personality is going to be shaped into how we think, how we feel, how we behave. All of those aspects are going to help us identify different aspects of personality. So let's get going. Let's move into who the theorists are and how they help us understand this. First of all, we have to go way back to Hippocrates, back to 370 BCE, way back. One of the things that Hippocrates gave us is this idea that there may be 4 different kinds of individuals, 4 personalities. He talked about choleric, melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. And these were based on different kinds of fluids that he had identified coming from the body. Now, this is not a theory we still hold on to, but it was the foundational understanding. So in this case, choleric were individuals who had a lot of yellow bile that came from the liver. And he saw that they had some traits that were pretty consistent. Everybody had that kind of yellow bile. By the way, I don't know exactly how we got all the yellow bile, but how that happened was part of that component. And that's how he went into developing melancholic, sanguine, and phlegmatic. Now we get to move forward to the next segment. And this is where Galen came along about 1,000 years later. He took what Hippocrates had presented and he adapted it. Not so much about fluids, but that yes, there were these 4 different kinds of generic personalities. And what's most interesting for me specifically is that we actually see some of these descriptions of personalities reintroduced in the last couple of decades. They've been given new names. You may have taken a personality inventory. Frequently, these are available in like small group settings or online. And like one of them, I am a sea otter, which I like that one. Others, you can be maybe a color or perhaps a Disney princess, but these are the components that actually in so many ways are fueled by some of what Hippocrates started with and Galen further on developed. So choleric is no longer about yellow bile, but it's about passion and ambition and boldness. And so a choleric person would be that kind of a person. And we've actually brought some of these terms into how we understand personalities just as adjectives. So a melancholic person is someone who's reserved or anxious or unhappy. And we now address melancholic as kind of that sad or dour kind of presentation. So we now have pulled language in and it helps us understand personality. Move forward a few hundred years and we're in the 1700s, and now we have Franz Gall. And he introduced a way of understanding personalities that is one of the more entertaining ways, aside from bile and looking at people's livers. He thought that if we could just figure out what the lumps on your head were, they would help us understand your personality. And he calls this phrenology. So there was a lot of activity, mostly in the upper classes of people, where they would gather together for a party and then they would have a personality interpretation based on skull feeling and figuring out where the bumps were. Now, the reality is that has nothing to do with personality. Well, I mean, we did understand that when you stick a tamping rod through your frontal lobe, it could have something to do with personality. But aside from those kinds of situations, just the way your skull is shaped has nothing to do with helping us understand specifically related aspects of personality. In the 17th century, Immanuel Kant also added to some of the ways we think about things. He felt like there were temperaments that shaped some of how we understand personality. Wilhelm Wundt, great name, in the 19th century added to this, giving us these ways of conceptualizing related to emotional or non-emotional and intersecting with changeable versus non-changeable. Understanding some of those gives us 4 different quadrants and understanding how we play out or operate or what traits are part and prominent for individuals. This is a way of explaining personality. In some ways, it may be a way of predicting how someone might move forward, but reliable and valid, still questions on that. And that lends us to when Freud comes along and he adds more understanding. Freud, our old friend, he brought all sorts of those ideas that development and personality is going to be shaped by these drives that we have that compel us. And he felt like sex was a prominent drive. That's why his developmental theory was so focused on sexual components. Neo-Freudians came in and removed the sexual emphasis, but felt like there was still a drive component and there's key names associated with that. So that's where we're heading in the next video. We're going to talk about the key theorists, we're going to talk about the key theories, and we're going to give you a sense of maybe understanding a little bit more about yours.